Okay, so my friend Richard and I are at the intersection of 7th and Stanford, and we're about to talk about some backstory to the narratives that we're going to go through on the Boyle Heights bus tour. And I just wanted to introduce him at this intersection in front of this bumper sticker we just found, which I think is Jesus, Hearts, Forgiveness. I'm going to go ahead and assume that Mark 4:22, which I'll look up in a minute, is something to do with the truth setting you free. I'm going to go ahead.
Well, it's my philosophy has always been the truth won't set you free, it'll only get you 90 days observation at a Tascadero.
That's good. We are here because we're interested in talking about the events that happened at a residency hotel that's no longer here. In the preceding segment in this video, I was talking with Mark Wild about Dana Bartlett, New Bethlehem Center, and All Nations Church. All Nations Church actually opened just one block over at 6th at Gladys Park, what is now Gladys Park. The building's been torn down. All Nations is, of course, important because Brumley Oxnam was driven out of Los Angeles by the Better American Federation, which was headed up by Harry Haldeman. Harry Haldeman, of course, was the grandfather of H.R. Haldeman, who was Chief of Staff for Richard Nixon. This brings me back standing next to my friend Richard, whose father was the United States Attorney for the Central District of California.
Correct.
Under Richard Nixon's administration, and your father was involved in the Nixon campaign from 1950 on.
And the California campaign manager for the presidential campaigns.
Okay, so your father was deeply involved in Republican politics.
Absolutely.
In 1970, how long had he been appointed the United States Attorney at that point in 1970 under
He was
Nixon?
sworn in spring, early spring, midwinter 1970.
Okay, so he'd been
Maybe 4 or 5 months.
okay, and so we're here, and we want to talk about an incident that occurred at this corner in a hotel that's now gone. Monday, May 13, 1970. Do you want to set up what? Let me set up the incident, and then maybe you.
Sure.
No, let's jump in. You're watching television with your dad.
Yeah, it was about 12, the 11 o'clock news locally, and he was sitting there. I was home from school, and we saw a newscast that indicated a shooting had taken place here, very near here, and he leapt out of his seat, went into the den, picked up the telephone, and called the Justice Department's office. He said, "Who's on this? You guys are seeing what I'm seeing. We have marshals there. We have assistant U.S. attorneys there." And he was not happy. And ordered them down there. He got dressed and he left the house and drove to this location to help his investigators.
And almost immediately, witnesses were put in custody, for protective custody. I was just reading up on some articles in the Times, and I thought that was interesting.
Yes, and one in particular. One was spared from being shot because his leg became entangled in a fire escape in the back of the building, which was fenced in, and from which there was no exit, the yard back there. And he was hospitalized, wearing nothing more than his underwear. He was given a set of blue jeans, no shoes, and a toothbrush, and discharged from the hospital.
Let's back up. I got a little ahead of myself by talking about witnesses being put in federal protective custody. Your father left the house, came down here, and he was investigating a shooting that occurred in what was then a residency hotel.
Correct.
And involved were both the LAPD and officers from the San Leandro Police Department.
5 LAPD and 2 San Leandro cops were involved.
Okay, and this centered around looking for a suspect for a purported suspect in San Leandro.
Correct.
And the San Leandro police had come down. LAPD officers are helping them look for someone. Do you want to set up what happened, the chain of events that happened that caused the LAPD and San Leandro officers to enter this hotel?
They were looking for a fellow whose last name I don't recall. All I know is that his first name was Dan. His description was Latino, Hispanic, male, 5'6", black hair, black mustache. That's the only description they were working on.
So they're in a patrol car. They're driving up and down 7th Street. This is Skid Row. It was Skid Row then. It's a tough part of town. Okay. And what's the eureka moment?
Well, they had a witness who apparently was acquainted with the person they were looking for, and she was, from what I understood, recall from the time we heard from my father, was a heroin addict who was being treated with methadone, but was in withdrawal because she was off the methadone. She was allegedly a prostitute, and at the time that they had her in this patrol car, there were 2 cars, she was on LSD.
Okay, so at some point she said, there he is.
She didn't point up.
Oh.
What happened was she saw a drunk roll out from behind a car that was up on blocks and said, "That's Danny," while she was looking at the drunk rolling out from the car from behind him. The cops were looking up at the 3rd floor of the hotel that's now gone, and they saw a male, Hispanic, dark hair in the window shaving at the bathroom.
Right. I'm afraid we're going to have to stop for a second. And stop for this tractor trailer. They see a man in the window.
They're looking up. She's looking down. They determine that is the suspect.
And so they enter the SRO.
Well, they call for backup. Okay. They surround the building. They being LAPD, black and white. How many cars, I don't know. Particularly, they surrounded the rear of the building, which was fenced off, and from which, if you came down on the fire escape, there was no exit. Right. So if you were in that yard, you were stuck. And they went upstairs, and basically to the top floor in the apartment where they'd seen the fellow in the front, and they blew the door open and blew the shotguns. I think immediately killing at least 1 person, maybe 2. And when all of this broke out, this one fellow attempted to go out the window to the fire escape, which was the gunfire.
The one that was taken into protective custody that was essentially just in his underwear, discharged just in blue jeans.
With a broken leg. And from the fall, because he got hung up in the fall. I think one of the ones who went out the window did jump to the ground and was killed by gunfire before he hit the ground. It's my vague recollection.
Okay, so that's basically the incident. A lot of activity in this case. So that's basically the incident. And your father opened up an investigation.
He awaited the results of the investigation inquiry by LAPD in San Leandro into it themselves. And at the end of that process, determined that there were too many questions for me to answer about this apartment, why these people, and thus what I've just explained about the witness looking this, that, and the other. Right. Those things were not divulged
So he set up a grand jury.
He conducted an investigation and forwarded it to the grand jury.
Yeah. This is all. This is all leading up to the tour This is all leading up to the tour because your father also a few months later opened up an investigation into the killing of Salazar.
Again, after a lengthy investigation.
And so there's some overlap in both of these investigations because at both points your father, who was simply investigating the situation which he felt had unanswered questions, received a great deal of flack from in the shooting we're discussing here that occurred here on 7th Street from Chief Davis, the Los Angeles Police Department, and Mayor Yorty,
and Sheriff Pitches,
who you were friends with.
My father was Peter Pitches. Sheriff Pitches was my father's mentor in all of this.
By the time your father opened an investigation over the Salazar killing after Pitches' department investigated it.
Exhaustive, lengthy review of the autopsy and all the rest of that.
And Pitches was that was a strain on their relationship,
to put it mildly.
But yet your father did it not because he was there to piss anyone off, or it was the point was to
to carry out his constitutional duties. There were still unanswered questions. There was great foment of a lot of different types in East Los Angeles. No one was willing to accept, even though the review of the autopsy had been televised, they weren't prepared to accept the fact pattern they were being given. And moreover, the fact pattern wasn't complete, and my father felt that in order to support law enforcement and close the books on the case, or to determine if an indictment was required further investigation than been conducted. And federal investigation, because it would be, the Sheriff's Department investigating itself is a worthy idea, but it isn't in and of itself satisfactory to the citizenship. The citizenry of the city.
Yes, and the LAPD, a similar situation exists for the LAPD.
Greatly, and has for generations.
And this is actually, and I would like to just wrap up, because this was the great question about your father's investigation sort of pointed at this question, and Otis Chandler, 10 years later, wanted to ask this question again, which is, how do you quantify the behavior of local law enforcement? Is there a way, without getting the chief of police, without getting the mayor, without getting the sheriff really mad at you and calling you terrible names, is there a way to just look at their behavior and say, overall, putting civil rights violations aside, which was solely the job of your father's investigation, was to look for civil rights violations, but just to step back even a bit and say, how can we quantify how well the LA County Sheriff's Department is functioning as a law enforcement entity? How well can we quantify how well the LAPD functions as a law enforcement entity? These are questions that no one's been able to answer, and people, I think people would like to be able to ask them eventually.
Well,
and get answers that are sound.
We know that historically, going back to the first quarter or so of the 20th century, it didn't perform well at all. In fact, it was corrupt, and as was the mayor's office. But LA municipal codes were changed such that to separate, there's no politics. You don't run as a Democrat or
that's a whole tour we give with John Bunton.
At the end of the day, my father's view was, look, there are unanswered questions. It's the federal prosecutor's responsibility to determine what happened, to satisfy the constitutional rights of those to satisfy an investigation of the support of the constitutional rights of the victims, whether it's Ruben Salazar or the Mexican nationals killed here. Those weren't the end of his cases. The reality is, in those days, the mayor and the police chief were more personality than law enforcement or the government, in my opinion, and performed such in their capacities in criticizing the federal review. It would strike me that if they wanted the questions answered resolutely to satisfy their constituencies, why not permit the investigation if they're so certain of its outcome?
I think that's a great place to leave it. And you're going to get on the bus, and when we get to South, you told me you were.
Okay.
And you're going to talk about you're going to talk about your dad and the Ruben Salazar case a little bit, just from your experience as his son and growing up in that house.
Well, and believe me, in the audio stuff I gave you with his interviews, he took no joy in prosecuting police officers. He was a supporter of law enforcement in Los Angeles.
Peter Pitchess, the sheriff of the county of Los Angeles.
Many times we visited him in his home and were entertained by him and vice versa in our home. But, as my father said at the time, a prosecutor makes somebody mad every day.
Yes, I read that in the article. It's a great.
It comes with the truth. And if he had to alienate a friend to defend the Constitution, so did he.
We're gonna end on that. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
We'll see you on the bus.